Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us
Good evening.
today. Hello. Hi, Chris. My name is Sofia Lovegrove. I'm an independent researcher and curator based in the Netherlands, and I'm very happy to introduce you the third of our 4 virtual gatherings. Lives of Objects Virtual Gatherings is a project of the Goethe-Institut, led by the Goethe-Institut in London. And my role in this project has been to develop the curatorial concept. We created this series as a platform for discussion between cultural workers, scholars, and artists to explore the different meanings and implications of restitution work. By restitution work, we refer to the process of recovering or returning ancestral belongings and historic objects that were taken to Europe during colonial times, often in very violent circumstances. We view restitution as part of a larger process of reparations for historical violence and its ongoing effects on the present. We acknowledge that the loss of ancestral belongings, cultural heritage, and knowledge is but one of the effects of the long and violent history of European colonialism. We acknowledge this violence while at the same time being hopeful that restitution work, when carried out with care, can contribute to developing more equitable relations. Our 4 online gatherings bring together important African and African-European initiatives in a way that also challenges the growing Eurocentric discourse on this topic. Each gathering focuses on one topic, yet they are all interconnected. Each conversation will include a moderated discussion amongst our speakers and moderated by our moderator, Sherry Davis, and we invite you all to actively join in, to share your thoughts and ask questions. I will now introduce Sherry Davis. Sherry is an award-winning musician, filmmaker, and curator with a passion for utilizing the arts to inspire social justice. She has recently been working on a very inspiring arts project called Ode to the Ancestors, which commemorates the Black contribution to conservation and archaeology in East Africa. A beautiful exhibition of photographic archives that celebrates Kenyan heritage professionals from in and around the colonial periods is currently on display at the Horniman Museum in the UK, but only until the 3rd of December this year, and is also touring Kenya with the National Museums of Kenya. So if you have a chance, I would really recommend a visit. Sherry, on to you now.
Thank you, Sophia. This event will include a moderated discussion with the speakers, but will make room for input and questions from everyone who's joined us today. So in today's conversation, we'll explore the possibilities, limits, and potential problems of digitally regarding issues of accessibility and ownership in relation to the broader issue of restitution. We'll be addressing questions such as who makes data and knowledge available and for whom? How can digital access advance restitution work? What is digitally returned and how? And do these efforts have a real impact on the communities and countries that were dispossessed of their material culture and ancestral belongings? So I'm very happy to introduce our amazing speakers for today. Anne Luther is a specialist for digital heritage and digital humanities scholar and principal investigator for Digital Benin. This project recently received the Apollo Award for Digital Innovation of the Year. Congratulations for this recognition. Karen Ijumba is a senior researcher of Open Restitution Africa. Eiloghosa Obobaifo is an anthropologist and researcher in the Digital Benin project. Dr. Temi Odumosu is an art historian, curator, and assistant professor at the University of Washington Information School in Seattle, USA. So we're going to start the conversation with a screenshot of Digital Benin showing a specific brass commemorative head of Mhumu Alao. This particular object was returned by the University of Aberdeen to Nigeria and is included in the collaborative platform Digital Benin. As we bring that slide up, I'm going to put a question to Eiloghosa. You have done a lot of research on the historic objects of the Edo Kingdom. For those who might not know, when people refer to the Benin bronzes in the context of the restitution debate, what are they referring to? What is their significance? And what do we see on this screenshot specifically?
Thank you so much, Sherry. What we see on the screen right now is an image of a commemorative head that was returned to Nigeria by the University of Aberdeen. And This particular object is the head of an Oba who lived and ruled in Benin. And this was a practice before 1897, even till today, that when an Oba transitions, a commemorative head is casted in brass and placed upon an altar that is created for him. This commemorative head was used as a base for the elephant tusk on which the Oba's life achievements or activities are being carved on. And the shrines and altars dedicated to ancestors have various other objects, and the commemorative head is one of them. There are different types of this commemorative head. We have the brass ones, which were exclusive to the royal courts, to the Obas, and we had the wooden ones that were used by chiefs and other people in the kingdom. And the practice of having the commemorative head placed on an altar dates back to even the Ogiso period, which was a period before the Obaship. And the object displayed here is among 5,000 other historical objects currently located in museums, predominantly in Europe and the USA. As a result of the so-called British punitive expedition that took place in 1897, in which the royal artifacts from the kingdom were looted. Over the years, there have been calls from the monarchs and members of the royal court in Benin, as well as the government in Nigeria, for the return of these artifacts. About a decade ago, the Benin Dialogue Group was formed by Professor Barbara Plackensteiner with museum members such as the MAC in Hamburg and the British Museum, the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, and others to support the restitution efforts. In this group, the desire to have a database that will show which objects are located currently was formulated, and as a starting point for these processes, Digital Benin brought together a team of researchers, designers, and developers in 7 countries. And this brought about where this team built an online platform beginning in 2020. For the first time in 126 years, Digital Benin shows over 5,000 historic objects in one place, when the objects are still located in 131 institutions in 20 countries. We built a catalog that shows a search across over 400 data sets from these institutions, including 12,000 images. The online platform also presents different entry points into the study of objects. EOTO, for example, is a foundational learning space about the function, the use, production, and historic Benin objects and their Edo designation. Oral history embedded in the historic objects in traditional knowledge from the Edo community, the Itendo showing a socioeconomic and historical context for the objects, both developed by my colleague, Godfrey Ekato. Provenance names presenting the network of actors in the movement of the objects outside of Benin, and more spaces, and there are other spaces to explore. We are launching an archive space with over 5,000 archival documents regarding to the object this December. Okay, so come back to the object on screen. This is an object that has been restituted to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria by the Aberdeen University. The object was also returned, and the institution transferred all digital rights and as well as all data relating to the objects to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments as part of the restitution process. This is, as far as we know, an exception in the restitution process, that all digital assets presented on the Digital Benin currently belong to the institutions that are holding the object, except for this particular object showing on the screen.
Thank you so much for that response. It's great to learn more about the specific object and the work that you've done on Digital Benin. In last week's event, we discussed the concept of epistemic restitution. Can digital restitution also support the restitution of knowledge? And can I ask that question to you again, Eiloghosa, please?
Yes, it does, because with the advent of Digital Benin, I have personally experienced, because I have worked with the Museum for West African Arts, MOA, that's currently being built in Benin City. And we had a program last year, where we had to engage with school students, and Digital Benin as a source guide was very helpful in communicating and in showing these students different aspects of the culture which they have, or which they before then did not have access to. So it's, I think, not just having the object returned, but also having being that we have most of our information online these days. So it's also a good approach to have the digital assets also restituted.
Thank you for that. So on the screenshot, we see the Edo designation as well as the English designation. Can you tell us about this choice? And also talk more about the research you carried out on the Edo designations.
Okay, so working on the Digital Benin project, I myself and my colleague Godfrey Ekato had to work specifically in the Lagos and Benin museums, and we had to go through their data, which was mainly presented in their catalog cards and inventory books. And we had to bring this online. So I had to transcribe all of the catalog cards manually. So in the process of this, I discovered that some of the names that were presently representing the object were not in the right order, or they were wrong because they maybe misspelled, or this also posed the problem of misrepresenting the object. So it became very important to try and bring in the right Edo designation. So we carried out research in Benin, spoke to guild members whose ancestors produced this object and they are still producing today. We spoke to professors from the University of Benin, and we spoke to local historians as well. So we took, it was a rather long process to get the right Edo designations for the object. So I see this as a a step in trying to recontextualize and put the objects in their right context, because this also help you understand them better and understand their function, use, and the production guilds or the guilds that are associated either by production or use.
Thank you so much for that. So I have a question for Karen. In the last few years, we've been seeing more and more digital platforms being created that aim to make collections visible and accessible. These often follow different approaches. I'm thinking here of projects like Digital Benin, Invisible Inventories Program in Kenya, the Ghana Restitution Inventory Project, as well as the Data Hub that's currently being developed in the Netherlands. You'll see a link in the chat. So my question is, can such initiatives help advance restitution work?
Thanks for the question, Sherry, and hello to everybody who is in attendance today. I think Eiloghosa has kind of highlighted the ways in which something, inventory project can be quite useful in restitution work. But I think my initial response is not always. It's depending on the intention. And I think if the intention is driven by Africans and by a question within Africa, then I think it does have the possibility of supporting restitution work. And I think that the point that has been put across with Digital Benin as well is that it's not a fixed presentation of an entry. It's an invitation to question. It's an invitation to change the narrative around something. It's an invitation to rethink the context within which this object, position, artifact has been imagined, and also how it can be re-entered into the space that it's going back to. So this digital interface just kind of shows you how fluid the knowledge around something still is, and the opportunity for the entry and revisiting and questioning, and the opportunity to rethink how this artifact, or this object, or this possession has been presented or preserved in a European context, and how it can be returned to represent the community from which it comes from. But definitely, if the intention is driven by an African for an African, it has the potential to support restitution work. But if the centrality of it is for people to just kind of digitize their collections and show people what they've got, to kind of say, here it is, do with it what you will, I think it becomes a waste of resources, because you're not thinking through what the next thing might be coming from being able to present these artifacts in the book.
That's such a strong point on intentionality. And during our talks before this event, you mentioned the problem of unequal access to resources, such as having a stable Wi-Fi connection. Could you share your thoughts on this, please, Karen?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I'm speaking from a position of privilege. My capacity to even be on this call right now is from a position of privilege. I have 24/7 connection to Wi-Fi. I'm able to kind of type anything in and look at what I want whenever I want. But that's not the reality for particularly most Africans. We're living in a low resource environment. We're living in an environment with low digital literacy as well. So if you present this to somebody, the format within which it's presented, it doesn't seem immediately useful until you've gotten the training or the knowledge to understand how to navigate a database like this. And so even just in speaking about intention, if your intention is to offer this knowledge to somebody who doesn't have those resources or those kind of skills to be able to navigate what you're creating, it becomes a bit problematic. There are people who are working within Africa to think about, how do I serve a low-resourced community? How do I make these databases downloadable and used offline? How do I almost circumvent things like copyrights and whatever the case may be, or intellectual property rights, to allow these things to be used by people who don't necessarily have access to them or be able to travel to that particular country to be able to view them. And so I think thinking about the context within which we are in, creating a digital repository that has like 300 DPI images in there, or even like 3D kind of photographs in there, and thinking about who has access to that, is somebody who's well resourced. It's quite a small, maybe not the 1%, but definitely not like the 100% of people type thing. And so being conscious of the fact that resources are not the same across the world, and particularly in Africa, becomes important to consider when you're creating platforms like this.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So let's go on to Temi with the very colorful, lovely shirt today. You've done a lot of research on ethics of care in a digital context, with museums and governments increasingly putting their collections online, being it historic objects, photographs, or archival materials. What do you see as potential risks or problems, particularly in the context of collections that derive from or are connected to the colonial past?
That's a really good question. From my perspective, especially as an educator of information scientists, as well as someone who has spent time researching in these collections, I think it's really important to kind of go back to the basic understanding of what the digital is and what it means. So on the one hand, we have digitization as a computational language, translating or converting something in the material, the physical world, into computational data so that it can be read on a screen or read on a laptop or wherever. But the other meaning of the digital, the kind of old meaning, is fingers, hands, pointing, indexing. So from my perspective, digitization is pointing to something that happened, right? It's a way of saying that, okay, this is a reproduction, a replication of an original thing that says something about what happened in a particular context. And so from that perspective, whenever you digitize, you're carrying all of that baggage, those stories, those histories, those violences, that trauma into the space of the digital. And most institutions, be they museums or archives, they tend to think of digitization in a very neutral way, that somehow by going into the digital space, it kind of flattens the history and it's just JPEG files or it's just text and image. But in fact, it's an index for something else. And that's why when Eiloghosa was talking about Digital Benin as a source guide, that's exactly what it is, right? That this repository is a way to navigate through the history and then also find ways of interpreting in the present day. So for me, many of the problems are to do with this initial translation. What does it mean to digitize? And then from there, you start to think of a whole range of ethical issues in terms of ownership and language and labeling, and who is even control of the server. Some institutions don't even have control over the cloud that their documents go to. They end up in big tech companies. So then, who has the rights, who really is taking care of this material? So it's a lot of complexity, but for me, my starting point is, what does the digital mean? What does it do? And then you can, from there, begin to think about these questions of harm that is translated from the original to the reproduction.
And if I can follow up with you, Temi, you've been working together with Digital Benin to reflect and provide advice on the use of colonial photographs. Could you just tell us some more about this? And we're going to see a link also to the work in the chat.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to be asked by Digital Benin to think alongside the whole group about what it means to allow the general public to see photography from the looting and the desecration of 1897, but also photography from the whole process of the artifacts and the cultural property being extracted and then put into private institutions and people's homes. So photography documents this whole process, and to see things, to see the way colonial representatives or what they chose to keep, what they chose to hold in the space of photograph is very difficult. And so we've been thinking together about, it's important to have this as a kind of evidence base, but what is here and what are the effects, the psychological and other emotional, spiritual effects of confronting some of the very deep violence that gets represented in these images. And some are already available online. If you typed in Benin 1897 or even just Benin bronzes, you would immediately find in Google Images a whole range of photographs from the colonial archive. That's one thing, what is already available online or in blogs or in journalism, but to actually bring everything together in one place intentionally, and for that to be accessible, not just for the general public, but for the Benin community in terms of this educational work and this healing work that is taking place, that's something else. And when you look closely at what is there, it's not easy. It's not easy viewing. The labeling is not easy reading. And you have to confront many of the issues of colonial violence. So we've just been thinking about, should we share? How do we share? Who will do the work of retranslating, recontextualizing this imagery?
Thank you for that. So I have a question for Anne. What makes Digital Benin different from, say, a database of a European museum?
I think many things. Thank you for the question. It's an interesting question for me because, I work on the technical side of things and not on the sort of content research side. So Eiloghosa for sure could answer this on the, side of the recontextualization that she mentioned in her introduction. For me, on the sort of technical side, the main difference is that a European institution has one data source, which is the museum. Oftentimes, of course, there are multiple data sources within the institution, but generally you're looking at one institution, and that is the sort of approach that an institution takes when sharing the collection online or internally. Digital Benin, however, started the presentation of the historic objects from the view of where they came from, the community of origin, the context in which they were made and produced and used. And from this, we then went into research and search to find the institutions and the objects within the institutions, also of institutions that did not have a database. So we worked with all institutions that, on the spectrum of no database, who could share information in emails or in conversation, to institutions that have multiple databases and multiple repositories for their object data. I think this is the main difference when thinking of, what Karen mentioned of the approach of making an intentional database. Which approach are you taking? And we came from the approach of the community of origin.
Thank you for that. So during our conversations before this event, you brought up an important point about the role of museums making data accessible. You mentioned that most European institutions often take a reactive rather than proactive role. And could you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it goes back to exactly the point of approach. If a community of origin wants to find their objects, they need to know where the objects are located currently, because the role of the institutions is often a reactive role in restitution, in accessibility, in also the policies around digitization, in the sense that they sort of, bring object documentation online, and then this is where it ends. However, if we imagine a sort of proactive approach of institutions, that would also allow us to think about accessibility that doesn't mean that an institution is representing
something in the way that they would represent an institutional knowledge of objects that they are holding. A proactive approach could mean that digital assets could be shared in a way that doesn't make sort of the digital assets accessible, for example, for everyone. So proactively reaching out to communities of origin, I think is a position that allows us to think what Temi mentioned about also conditions of digitization, conditions of access with the technology, or as Karen mentioned, with an analog way of making knowledge about the objects in the institution accessible.
That's really important. Thank you so much for that, Anne. So if I can go back to Eiloghosa, what has been the impact of Digital Benin in Nigeria and the Edo state, to be more specific, and how have you been using this platform in your work?
Thank you so much. It's something to know that you've been part of a production process for something, and you also see it being used by people around you for the purpose in which it was used for. So I've seen Digital Benin being used by facilitators in schools, and I've also seen it being used by guild members whose ancestors produced these objects, and they're still producing, and they were part of I would say the production process of Digital Benin, because we also went to them for research, and we took back the products to them, and it was well received because they got to see objects that they before now did not even imagine they could have seen, because not all of them would have had the opportunity to travel outside of Nigeria to see these objects where they are currently being placed. So I've also gotten requests or messages from people who have also used Digital Benin in their academic thesis, and I have seen it being used in the way it was intended to be used.
And that's amazing that your work has had so much reach. So I'll come back to Karen. On the website of Open Restitution Africa, we found the following quote. In restitution, data serves as the foundation for understanding historical events, quantifying losses, and identifying individuals or communities impacted by injustices. What are your views on the usefulness of data in restitution processes?
Be something quite beautiful. The founders are Malemo, who is a computer engaged, wonderful and robust, because the possibilities of what can be done around restitution are always really, really interesting. And so between those two very differently crafted or differently kind of pathwayed minds, what they identified was that restitution is happening across the continent, but there's no database of like how it's happening, what it looks like, what it's intended to achieve, and what hinders it, what enables it. That database is not available. There's no kind of centralized place, as Temi was saying, there's no centralized kind of place to access information around restitution, and more specifically around processes of restitution. And so when somebody in Ghana is embarking on a restitution journey, they have no access to what somebody in Zimbabwe did. When some on a restitution journey, they have no idea what's happened in Namibia. And what Open Restitution Africa is trying to do, and having a lot of barriers in terms of understanding how how to translate things from stories to data. But what we are trying to do is to make these activities juxtaposable and comparable, and that middle ground comes through data. And what that looks like in real time is working with Africans who are familiar about restitution in their context, asking them to gather stories from people who are working within restitution and undertaking restitution activities. And that's across the spectrum, from people who are just trying to visibilize the importance of restitution, to demanding restitution, to being in the process of negotiating restitution, to people who are now trying to reintegrate certain we call them possessions, but I guess objects and artifacts back to the rightful owner country. And we're gathering these stories and then finding a way to make them comparable. And what that data is then going to do is release a set of understandings around the trends in African restitution, around insights, what are the challenges and what are the breakthroughs. And so data becomes a way for us to share what we're learning about doing this thing that we're doing, but in probably very multiple kind of ways. And it's not easy work, I think, because even in our process of developing the platform, we've also become really aware of how power is just a thing that exists in knowledge. It's just like something you cannot get away from. So as we are making decisions, trying to say, like, you take out a word and you're like, why did you take out that word? Or you've got a case study researcher is working with you and you feel a different way and you're not sure how to present that conflict. So even in getting to the point of developing data, which is this thing of like everything is comparable in one way, we're having to understand that how to present knowledge as negotiated, to be transparent about how we got to a certain understanding of something. And so, yeah, it's interesting work, but our hope is that that data and being transparent about how we've come to that data is kind of going to open and spend a whole lot of money to be able to understand how they're trying to make things move in one context and how it can help in another. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We are going to be coming to the audience to ask questions. So just to remind everyone, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please put your questions and comments within the Q&A and we'll come to you very soon. I'm going to come back to Karen and just ask a little bit more about how is Open Restitution Africa working with data to explore restitution processes. Is she still with us? Yes, you are.
I'm still here. I was hopeful that I'd answer the question, but I can try in a different way. I don't know. I'll give you examples from our case studies, right? So at the moment, we have in our first cohort of case study researchers, we had a case from Namibia around the return of 23 objects from a German museum, and the conversations that the museums in Namibia now have to have around engaging with communities about who actually owns the objects first and foremost, because that provenance research is not there, but then the strategies that they're trying to use to be able to reintegrate these objects into the communities that they belong to. On the other side of the continent, we've got a case study in Kenya about the return of human ancestors from Kenya to Tanzania through a British institute or British research kind of institute that grabbed a lot of stuff from across the continent and moved, because this is what people did in colonial times, and are now returning it because of a change in leadership and understanding that we shouldn't have these things here because they belong elsewhere. And
it's frozen a little bit.
Comparison to each other to see how one strategy might be. Oh, sorry, to see how, am I back?
You're back.
Okay. To see how a community engagement approach in Namibia could support the community engagement approach in Tanzania. And that's what data allows us to do. It allows us to look at these two scenarios that exist completely separate from each other in the real world, but have very similar concerns and possibly ways in which they can speak to each other to improve strategies or to kind of cross-reference each other. And what that then also creates is that when, say, Ngonso comes back to Cameroon, they now have 2 points of reference about how they can engage their communities to be able to return Ngonso back to the community. So data has the power to look across and connect where we might not necessarily see those things in the physical world.
That's fantastic that you're collating and disseminating this data from different institutions across the world. Yeah, congratulations for what you're doing. Really important work. So I'm about to come to the audience. Just one more question.
When we get there.
You're doing so well. And I love the fact that you're female founded and female led. Girl power.
Absolutely.
So I'll go on to Temi. When talking about restitution, one often thinks of material culture, historic objects, or ancestral belongings. But I would also like to briefly discuss other kinds of materials, such as archives, sound recordings, and photographs. Should these materials also be included in debates around restitution?
That's such a big question. But from my perspective, I mean, this conversation for me is so important. And what Karen has just been talking about in terms of creating a collaborative network of information that helps to support restitution across the continent, despite different contexts. I mean, that is mirroring the work of diaspora in some respects. So yes, it is important because when things were looted and extracted and stolen and taken, they weren't taken in isolation, right? The process was documented. They were taken with other materials. People started to write about them. They were cataloged. They then entered various institutions. There were receipts. There were, shipping labels, all sorts of things, which for the most part have been kept. So it's not just about the remains or the belongings, but it's also about all of the ways in which these entities have been described and documented. And so that all of that is part of the restitution process. But the thing about restitution is that sometimes we talk about restitution only as thinking about it as return, but this material and these ancestors are not returning to the same conditions or the same situation, right? They were taken in 1897, but they're returning to Benin in 2023, 2024. And that's a whole different set of constellations, community, patterns of relation, and so on. So we also have to make space for that change, both historically, culturally, linguistically. And I think that all of the material helps to support that process. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. So we are going to go on to the audience, the participants, to ask questions to the speakers that we have here today. So I have a question from Okpala Noisy. I'm so sorry if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. A vital point was raised by one of the speakers. Africa is not yet neck deep into ICT like the Western world due to poor resources, and the knowledge about ICT is not yet common among everyone. How can this be resolved so that digital resources will be easily accessible and affordable? That's a big question. I will put it back to, was it Karen? Were you the one that mentioned the resource issue?
Yeah. My first response is I don't know, but I also feel like people are becoming really creative about how they reproduce what is accessible online and then making it more low risk to be able to be distributed more widely. So I think what we don't have necessarily a capacity to do is to have like hundreds and thousands of like very high-res, high-tech digital kind of archives or repositories. But if as Temi, as Eiloghosa said, if we are intentional about getting those kind of presentations or representations to the level of like being able to share them on Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram or TikTok, or whatever the case may be, the possibilities for how that can circulate and be accessed by a myriad of people is, yeah, I think it's almost like limitless. So I think it's just about understanding how to put up the first print to make it possible for it to be reproduced multiple times. In terms of infrastructure, I throw my hands up, but in terms of the possibilities of knowing that you can reproduce something in ways that become more accessible with each print, I think that's kind of where the magic maybe lies.
Anne, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would like to maybe just point out one aspect that Karen has mentioned in her answer, which is the intention that we're sort of talking about here is restitution. And in Digital Benin, we have worked with lists. I mean, really spreadsheets. And what you see is what we've sort of put together on Digital Benin is we made the data that we've received in a very flat and very sort of list approach, accessible to our audiences, because at the moment there is a trend in institutions on a very high tech level of making information in institutions accessible through linked open data, through semantic webs, and so on. In order for an institution to even think about technology like this, they need to hire a tech team. They need to have an entire department on an administrative and policy level to bring in shareable knowledge like this is like on the high tech level. If we're talking about intention for restitution, we're building, for example, now in Digital Benin, we've received a 3-year grant from the Mellon Foundation to build a digital infrastructure that makes it possible to connect data that is based on the low tech level, as I said, even for institutions that don't have databases. So I think with the intention in the context that we're sort of, thinking about technology that we're using and producing, we can build low-tech solutions that still make the intention for restitution in a proactive way possible.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
That is a quotable quote. Thank you, Erin.
Yes.
Bye.
So going to the next question for participant Anthony Kalume. It's good to see you on the call. Would you like to come in on audio to ask your question, please?
Thanks, Sherry. Asante sana. I was going to look at repatriation as something that the procedure, is there any blueprint? Because I'm looking at pre-repatriation. How do the community of origin know what artifacts they need to ask for? How do they do that? And then during the process of getting the right museum and the right heritage institutions, that procedure is different from the pre. And then there's the post repatriation, when you got the things back and the encyclopedic museum is happy and says congratulations, and they go smiling back to wherever they came from, and you're left with the artifacts. Is there any way we can have a blueprint so that we have the pre and during the process and afterwards? Is there any research done around this? Because I'm very concerned about how generic people take repatriation as take it back to Africa and bye-bye. This is something that I'm really concerned about.
Do any of the speakers want to come in on that?
I want to say something daring and to offer the kind of idea that we should be encouraging each other to just dream and experiment as opposed to do research. Because the challenge, I mean, I think what Digital Benin and Open Restitution Africa have shown is that there are processes in place for going through databases, linking information, representing it, and then working within community to kind of reorganize and recontextualize things. But the other thing that you so poignantly pointed to it is what happens after, right? After something has been returned or an ancestor has returned, then what comes next? And I think that is the space of radical dreaming and possibility. That is where we need to start getting very inventive and thinking through how can we, I think it was Karen who talked about reintegration, or Eiloghosa, between the two of you, you were talking about reintegration. And this is something that if you think about Black people in the diaspora and the challenges of integration into different environments, but also the challenges of return, right? When people go home to their places of origin and the kind of translation and the cultural issues that need to be overcome. I think the same is true for works and ancestor remains that have been sitting in institutions for 150 years, and then they come back home and they need time to make their way back into the space of cultural belonging. And how do you do that? That's something we have to invent and discuss around and ideate around. So I see it much more as a community, a sustained community dialogue, of course, in relation to whichever institutions or stewards that are taking care of the material. But I see it as something very active, right? Rather than just about research. Yeah.
You mentioned such a wonderful point there, radical dreaming and possibility. And from listening to all of you today and the depth of work that you've had to undertake, it must be so massive. But you've achieved so much. You've reached so many people. You've corrected history, which is, for me, as a diasporan, half Jamaican, half Kenyan, born and raised in the UK, it means so much that I can access my African history because the likes of you have come together to make sure that it's accessible. So I feel like you should feel very proud of yourselves. Can I ask? I'm not sure who to direct it to. So anyone that wants to jump on, tell me about a moment where you felt proud of the work that you're doing. Is that too deep a question? Are we being humble women that don't like to talk about how proud we are of ourselves? Should I put someone on the spot? Can I ask Eiloghosa to come in on this?
I knew that was coming to me.
You're on the ground, so yeah.
Yeah, so trying to be humble, very humble, but I have, going back into the community, going back to the guild members or the local historians who we consulted and presenting the project, the Digital Benin projects to them, and the reactions we got, or I personally got. I had to, Android phones have this feature where you can make a web page into a small clickable app-like feature on your phone. So most people asked me to do that for them to easily access Digital Benin, and it was such moments actually gave me joy because it showed me that they wanted to go back repeatedly to go through Digital Benin and see the work that we have done.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Karen, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll share. I think it's we're not at
You're frozen. while we wait for Karen to come back, do yourself, Anne or Temi, want to speak to that question?
I'll turn my camera off so that I'm not, you see, joys of Africa.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So with what RA has provided is not provided, so we
The audio has gone again, I'm afraid.
That speak the same, they find a community that they can speak the same kind of language with. So I think the excitement first for me has been around being able to be a safe space for people who want to talk about restitution, kind of beyond dinner table talk, and really being passionate about how we can do that collectively. And I think the second proud moment is because we are building a platform from scratch. So we're having to decide what goes in and what goes out, down to like, is there going to be a scroll button on this thing? Like that's how granular this building is. And to have a moment of sitting with one of our case study researchers, his name is William Tsaka, and he's based in Kenya, has worked in museums for eons. Him engaging with the form and the capacity that the form gave him to just release so much knowledge around legislation, around the ways in which the Ngaji has been taken from Kenya, traveled to Britain, all the kind of collectives that have been gathered together to be able to kind of make this restitution process visible. Like seeing that information flow out of him with the form in front of him, I was like, come on, man, we're doing this. Like, so there's these little moments that kind of give you like, you know, when you're in the trenches of like, is this ever going to work? I feel like those moments where people are actually begin to glimmer or begin to glow because they're engaging with something that you're trying to build. I think those things are just like, they're the biggest kind of motivation so far, at least, yeah.
That's great to hear. Cool. I'm going to come to a question by Estella, but please keep your questions coming. Please don't feel shy, or comments, and you can put them in the Q&A. So I have a question from Estella, and she asks, how can new immersive technologies such as 3D scanning of objects, which then can be 3D printed or presented in virtual spaces such as VR, AR, and the metaverse, contribute to the process of restitution, and who should own the virtual images or replica models of these objects? For example, the Nefertiti bust was scanned by artists Nora Al-Badri and Jan Nels in 2016. The 3D model can be downloaded for free from the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. Can I direct that to, let me see, Anne?
Yes, I want to answer the question again with the intentionality that Karen really brought into the discussion here. I think with digitization or with representation in general, there comes a responsibility by the institution or entity that is producing such representations or digitization documentations. And there are possibilities that we can think of that, again, come from the context that is not suggested by the holding institution, but rather by the community of origin, as Karen and Eiloghosa and Temi and we all mentioned, because representation and sort of intentionality needs to come from that approach. So, for example, in Digital Benin, we're thinking about in situ augmented reality representations in Benin City of historic, of the historic objects. That is something that came up in the conversation from the very beginning of the sort of dreaming of a digital representation and the project. However, it needs to be clear that the digital is never a substitute for the return of objects. So this idea of the possibilities of augmented reality in situ situations, or the sort of material representation of an object that was printed or reproduced is really not a substitute for the knowledge and histories that objects are holding. On the other hand, this idea of the replica in Benin City, as Eiloghosa mentioned, we still have producers of these objects that are making original works. So if we're now sort of making reproductions that would allow a molding of historic objects, we're taking also away the livelihood of some of the guild members. So we really have to, think of all of these sort of aspects and possibilities in the context of the community of origin. There's just no way of just thinking about it on a conceptual or sort of museum institutional level approach.
A very important point, I think, to bring attention to the complexities involved with those types of things. So Sofia has a question for Karen, but also to the other speakers if you'd like to jump in. So Juma Ondeng mentioned in one of our conversations that restitution work is ultimately something that European museums and governments need to do. Is Open Restitution Africa working together with European institutions? And if so, how? And how does Karen and the other speakers think that initiatives like Open Restitution Africa and Digital Benin are pushing European institutions to do more and to do better?
Right. So we work with European institutions only insofar as they can offer contextual information around how a restitution processes happen. The objective is not to serve any kind of decision-making for them, but rather to support and enable decision-making within the continent. So when we're looking at data, if there is more data around how somebody has approached a really innovative way of enacting restitution, that would probably become more important than how a American curator or a German curator has taken on the fight of returning a particular artifact. It's those kind of balancing acts. The benefit needs to return back to the African first and foremost. It's not to dismiss work that is done with European museums, but I think our first and primary kind of benefactor is particularly African museum workers, African community activists, African researchers, African knowledge makers, disruptors, and also centering Africans within the conversation. For me, in a year, my perspective of what restitution is has kind of shifted completely, because you can start with the idea of thinking restitution is about, having a really loud ask for your thing back. And then you get exposed to maybe a customs official who was told a story about how human ancestors were taken, and because of that, is able to kind of say, we know these are the rules that would exist here, but we're going to allow for this to kind of happen, because it's resonant with what we think should be happening on the continent. So it kind of shifts the focus of where restitution is happening and how. We're looking at the level of movement from Europe to Africa, but within Africa, there's so much movement happening within people in themselves and around them to return value, to restitute, to repair, to recover. And those are the things that we are kind of trying to surface more so than, I guess, centering the European Museum and what they could or should be doing differently. Yeah. Different lane, I guess.
Thank you. Very, very good points, Karen. Thank you. So we've got an anonymous question. Is the Digital Benin project centered towards restitution alone?
No. Well, I don't think that restitution was the main focus for Digital Benin. But personally, I see it as a starting point for because with a project like Digital Benin, you're able to maybe track or pinpoint where these objects are currently, and you are then able to, know what steps or what directions to take to get a particular or the object back, I think.
Yeah, I would love to add to this. It was born out of a restitution dialogue, as Eiloghosa mentioned in her introduction. So it was born out of the desire to build a catalog, essentially, that shows which objects are located where. And the context of this then allows, or also brings the desire for institutions to then work on the restitution processes. So Digital Benin is not a substitute for restitution, as mentioned before. It is an enabler for restitution. It's a tool that can be used for restitution processes. And as we are all observing at the moment, museums have to actively work with a resource like Digital Benin on processes of restitution. So it's definitely in the context of the restitution process.
Thank you for that, Anne. And Karen mentions in the chat, it's about what the intersection of digital with cultural heritage enables, not merely what it presents. Visibility is not the end, it's the beginning. That's a nice quote at the end there. Thank you for that, Karen. So let's go over back to Temi. Could you tell me about the challenges you've experienced in your practice when it comes to involving source communities in the work of restitution, and how you overcame them, or how you are working actively to overcome them?
I'm not sure whether that question is for me, because at this current moment, I don't work with a source community around issues of restitution. I see my role in this conversation and in multiple spaces really as a facilitator for thinking through in a very granular and both technical and conceptual way what it means to be involved in this space of information sharing and production. What is data? What is digitization? How does it affect African people on the continent, but also in the diaspora? How are we involved? All these questions that people have been asking about, not just digital literacy, but also information redlining, places where, I mean, even here, I'm based in the US, there's places here where you can't get wireless internet, right? And this is supposed to be the quote unquote Silicon Valley hub. So this is really my role in this conversation space, to think through what it means to be involved in what the DeepMind founder Mustafa Suleiman describes as the coming wave, right? Which is, a reality in which we are inherently involved with algorithms and artificial intelligences in alternate forms of life and translation. And we have to figure out how we're going to participate moving forward. So that's my role in this.
Great, thank you for sharing about that. Anthony Kalume posted a link to his work. It's a dissertation on 3D printing as an acceleration for decolonization. Anthony, if you're still with us, would you like to...
I'm still here.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to summarize because it's a huge dissertation. But what I'm trying to argue is that there's a two-pronged approach in this decolonization and Africanization arguments, in that the encyclopedic museums are not willing to let go some of the artifacts. In that, I was told of by Dr. Hicks, who wrote the British Museum, that don't let them read your dissertation because they might get the get out of jail card. But the thing is, we have a problem with some of the artifacts that we want back. You know, right now we've got a row with the British Museum, with the Greek government about the Elgin marbles, and it's really, really affecting all us curators. So my dissertation was that we use 3D printing as a way to get the sense into the encyclopedic people that these artifacts are actually spiritual objects that are needed by the Community of Origins. So you guys can stay with the replica and please return the original artifacts back. So that was my argument. But then when I say two-prong is that we have also a problem in the communities of origin, because I have seen that most of the communities now are either Christians or Muslims. So they embrace the Abrahamic religion. So they won't be seen cohorts or, liaising with things that are considered evil and animalistic and, barbaric, So getting the 3D prints and showing that these things are harmless and they're supposed to be our, heritage, tangible heritage. That's what I wanted to come up with. These artifacts are being rejected by communities of origin because they don't want to be associated with them. So my dissertation was quite, even my senior lecturer was saying, you're teaching me something. I had to quote or cite myself because there was no literature written around this kind of thought. So we've got quite a problem here, but I put the link on the chat. So if you want to read it, it's something that we need to talk about. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anthony. Appreciate it. Sofia has another question. She says, thank you for all the great contributions. I have a question to Temi. In our conversations before the event, you mentioned the potential and real harm of making certain sorts of data accessible and visible. Is this something you can speak to?
Ooh, yeah, that's I'll try and be clear about this. So I'm an art historian by training. I teach in an information school now, but I've spent far too many years sitting in museum and gallery collections, and also in research libraries, taking out things primarily from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Getting dusty in the archives and feeling the effects of reading firsthand what colonialism looks like in practice. And that's everything from people's private diaries, the sketches they made and the sides of books, the kinds of images that they constructed about themselves, but also about other people who they engaged with. And it's pretty brutal, violent, dehumanizing, challenging. But I also will connect this experience, and when I say challenging, I mean on an emotional and a spiritual level, because on some very difficult level, and in some respects, it connects to what Anthony was just talking about just before, which is really about like self-love. I'm simplifying, but it's really about our internal relationships to ourselves and our histories and how they show up in these spaces, in these relationships to these collections. And so there are moments where you can be looking at a 19th century print that's very racist and suddenly feel the direct address of that image come towards your own body. And for me, that produces a kind of trauma. But, right now we have a situation in the space of AI, although now tech companies are starting to wake up, ethically speaking, is that the sort of sewage of the internet, the things that you don't see when you type into Google all of the horrific, pornographic, violent material, that goes somewhere, and somebody has to look at that material and code it as inappropriate. And right now, it's Africans on the continent. It's people in Kenya and other countries trying to participate in the digital space, but ended up basically doing content moderation for the West's psychic debris. This is also damaging in the present, traumatic. What are we going to do about it? So to encounter anything, and our ancestors were very wise in this regard. I come from a Yoruba culture that is very, very, there are so many rules about what you do and don't look at, precisely because there is an inherent understanding that when we look at things, they change us, right? They alter something in us energetically. And we can use that in a positive way, but it also happens negatively. So that's my mixed way of basically saying that, like, to do this work, one has to really consider what kinds of tools you put in place to detoxify from the effects of encountering this material, because it's very real. It's not just about the materiality, it's also about the symbolic information that's coming to you across time.
That's really interesting. I'd be interested to know how you detoxify when you come across this traumatic material. What would you advise people that are participating on this call? They've opened up the diaries, they've done the web searches, and they, like you mentioned, that feeling of trauma happens. What can we do to detoxify and navigate when we come across those types of images?
Well, in about at the beginning of January, I've done a collaboration with AM Digital. They digitize collections for universities and other collections, writing precisely about how to deal with distressing documents. So you check out my LinkedIn in about a month, and there'll be a link to some guidelines. But briefly here, I've been thinking through, for example, strategies like going into the archive with other people collaboratively, so not going alone, because there's something about the isolation that takes place when you're sitting, particularly when you're sitting physically in collections. The digital research has slightly changed things, but it's still similar, that there needs to be another eye, or multiple sets of eyes looking at this material, distributing in some respects the effect of this encounter. I haven't been in a collection for over a year. Right. So I don't just show up in archives and do things. I become very intentional. I plan it so that then I know, okay, I'm going to go into the history space now, which means I have to ramp up on my meditation, which means I have to really think about what kinds of contemporary media content I'm consuming in relation to whatever historical material. So there's like a whole set of protocols personally that I have to be involved in, but to do that, I have to plan research. I can't just do it continuously. And actually, when you talk to curators and people who work in museums and conservation, when you really ask them how they're dealing with this material, it's hard for them too. I've spoken to conservators who are like, we don't go down and mess with that object for too much. Like they have all of these stories, it's just that nobody's asking, right? So I think that, any self-care strategy is important just for general wellness. But when you're doing this work, you have to become very, very clear about why you're doing it, and how you're going to use this material and for how long, right? Am I going to be involved with this set of materials for 6 months, a year? Because all of that changes how you engage with it. That's just like a slice of like what actually becomes quite complicated when you're doing this as a research professional.
Totally. Thank you so much for giving us that insight. So we've come to the end of the discussion. I want to say thank you to all of our amazing, incredible speakers for sharing your thoughts today. Please check out and join us for our 4th and final event, which is taking place next week on Thursday, the 7th of December. We do hope that you can join us. It's free entry. Please invite your colleagues and friends to join us too. And without further ado, hopefully we will see you next Thursday. Take care.